Good afternoon, everyone. Today I am joined by Mr. Mark Hertling. And if you wouldn't mind just going ahead and giving a brief introduction to the audience.
Yeah, my name's retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. I'm currently a professor of practice in leadership and strategy at the Kremer School of Business at Rollins College. Spent 38 years in the military, retired in 2013 as the commander of U.S. Army Europe. Spent a couple of years in combat with three different units at different times in my career, traveled all over the world, and it's good to be with you on this podcast today.
Great. So initially, my first question is kind of what drew you to a career with the U.S. Army? And from that experience, were there any that shaped how you approach leadership?
Well, first of all, what drew me to the career was as a young man in high school, I didn't have enough money to go to college. And I had a guidance counselor who said, "Hey, there's this place in New York called West Point." And I knew about the academy, but he said, you can go there without any fees. And in fact, they pay you a small stipend every month just for going there. And all you have to do in repayment is give them 5 years of your life after you graduate. So I went for the first time on an airplane, first time ever outside the city of St. Louis. I flew to New York in 1971 and started my cadet career at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And what I found when I got there was it was a phenomenal experience. When you talk about what affected your leadership approach, it was certainly what I learned there. Even though during my high school days, I went to a all-male Catholic military high school, which was one of the bigger ones in St. Louis, and it was that's where things got started. But it was at the academy where I really had some experiences that took me outside of my comfort zone. It caused me to do things that I never would have imagined doing, traveling, taking on new challenges, and meeting people from all over the country. It was a very diverse student body, people from every single state and territory that's now expanded, and there's several international students. But when you have that many people from all over the country in one class of about 1,000 cadets, it makes for a very unique experience, especially given the demands of the academy and what the Army asks you to do.
That's great. And kind of, I guess, more on the education aspect, you touched on that, and that's how you kind of were shaped into the leadership style that you have today. Was there any specific class or anything that you could touch on a little bit more just to describe what at West Point really made the
Well,
leader you are?
Military Academy has a history, a unique history that most people don't know about. At the time when I entered in 1971, it was still an engineering school. I mean, everybody graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Engineering. And that's because when it was formed in 1804, when President Jefferson kind of was contrary to having a location where we trained military officers, he only gave in due to political influence, saying, "Well, I'll go with Washington and Hamilton in terms of and Knox in terms of establishing a military academy." But given the state of our nation and what we will have to do expanding westward, he says, "I want all of these future officers to also be engineers so they can build bridges and canals and roads and railroads." So that's what it was like. And if you look at the history of the academy in terms of the infrastructure of America from the East Coast to the West Coast, most of the major elements of the 18th and 19th century were built by West Point graduates, which is fascinating. Um, but when you ask what courses did really influence my military or my leadership style, it's interesting because I'll share this with your listeners since you're all at Virginia Tech. We had an average of a 21 or to 23 credit hour requirement every semester. So it was a pretty tough academic load. But you also have mandatory sports every day, whether you're on an intercollegiate team or an intramural team. You have the parades on the weekend and during the weekdays, and every minute of your time is consumed at the academy. It's a fascinating educational requirement. It's expanded significantly since then. I'll tell you, Haley, it's interesting for me because, again, I'm class of 1975 from West Point, and they have a program called the affiliation class where the 50-year graduates mentor the graduates of the 50-year in the future class. So the class of 25, which graduated just last May, was our affiliation class. So for the last couple of years with that class, I spent a lot of time with them mentoring, giving presentations, giving speeches, and knowing what they do today versus what we did is a lot more diverse, a lot more expansive, uh, more opportunities for the cadets in terms of studying abroad. The class president, who I dealt with pretty extensively, a young woman by the name of Catherine LaRue, is currently a Rhodes Scholar, and she's in at Oxford, the year after she graduates, along with four of her classmates. So those kind of things were very different today than when I went through. But you also have to understand at the military academy, you only get 1 month of vacation during the summertime. So the other 2 months are spent at some type of military training or at some location where you're executing the leadership requirements. And when you take a look at the mission of the academy, it's to build leaders of character for the nation. That is the mission statement. So everything you do there is a progressive approach to building your leadership skills. And that's, I think, more than anything else, that's what set me on a course for the future career that I had for 38 years, leading various size of organizations from my first 19-person tank platoon all the way up to a 90,000 army in Europe and everything in between. So each one of those demands in terms of a hierarchy of leadership teaches different lessons.
Wow, that's um very interesting to see that you went from 19 to the amount that you had at the last deployment. Branching off of that, during your time in the military, like you said, you held command at multiple different levels. Can you just explain to the audience a little bit more about these experiences, how they differed, and any challenges or even like responses that you had, and how you took the leadership and all of that from the academy?
Yeah, well, by design, what a military leader does is start at, the smallest organization. In my case, because I was an armor officer, I branched into the armor branch in cavalry. I started off with a 19 soldier plus me tank platoon on the old East German, West German border when the wall was still up. So I experienced the Cold War from an upfront and personal level with 19 young soldiers. And when you take a look at that, that's your first experience as a graduate. You immediately go there, you take over your platoon, and you're responsible for the training and the care and the moral responsibilities that you have for a team, but it's much larger than a civilian organization. And what the military does is they promote you from a hierarchical standpoint. So in every next assignment, you have more responsibilities, more people, more things to coordinate, an expansive level of opportunities and challenges. So after being a tank platoon leader, later on, I was a company commander with 120 people as a captain. So you go from lieutenant to captain. Then later, as a major, I was an operations officer, or what the civilian world would call a COO at a cavalry squadron, which had 900 soldiers. And in that particular role, it was the first time I went to combat, which was Desert Storm, where we had a cavalry squadron, which had a very unique mission. And in fact, I'm publishing a book in February. I think I mentioned to you that it was a journal to our two young sons from that time in combat of what we were doing in case I didn't come home. Title of the book is If I Don't Return, so that they would have the lessons of growing up and being a good human being from a dad that might not come home because we were told the chances of us returning were about 50% at the time. After that, a couple of years later, I was a squadron commander for a cavalry squadron, which consisted of about 1,500 soldiers. After that, I was a brigade commander for an organization that had 9,000 soldiers. I mean, you can see how it's progressive. And in each case, in each level, you're faced with coordinating more elements, taking care of more people through your subordinate leaders, having more difficult challenges and missions that you have to accomplish in different parts of the world. In my assignments, my wife and I, over a 38-year Army career, we moved 26 times all over the United States, spent a lot of time in Europe, spent 12 years of my career in Europe and 3 years in the Middle East during combat operations. So you can see that the intent is to expand your capability. And as long as you keep getting promoted, they're going to put more things on your shoulders.
Wow. That's so sad that you had to be put in that position, but we're grateful for your time in the military and um, we appreciate all that you did for our nation. In addition to your military career, you also had other careers as well. One of them that really stood out to me in particular was your experience with CNN as an analyst. And so I just wanted to know a little bit more about what your experience was like as a national security and military analyst.
Well, it's interesting. I'll share a story with you, but that was a part-time job. My full-time job when I retired from the Army in 2013 was I was working with a healthcare organization doing physician leadership and what they call global partnering, working with other countries to share healthcare ideas. But I got an offer because my last time in combat was in 2007 and 8, and I had a CNN reporter embedded with my unit for about 6 months. And when I retired, he told the CNN that I would be a good guy to be a military analyst. Um, so I got a call one day from somebody at CNN, and they said, "Would you like to do this?" And I said, "Oh, hell no. I don't want to be a military analyst. I had enough of you guys when I was working with you in the Army." But I had another conversation with a colleague of mine who was still in the Army at a very senior rank. And he asked me to reconsider that because he felt like the American public did not know much about what the military does. So I called CNN back, said I'd be willing to do this. So for a 10-year period of time from 2014 till 2024, I was their senior military analyst. And they would call me for all sorts of different things. It wasn't just to analyze, what was going on in Israel or what was going on with ISIS or Ukraine or any of the combat stuff. It was anytime they had a question about something related to the Army, they would call me and I would appear usually just like we're talking right now or from a studio. And it was, they would call with a topic and say, "We want you to talk about this." And if I knew about it from experience, I'd be able to talk about it. If I didn't, I would quickly study up and see what kind of factors were involved, but always doing sort of a pre-analysis. But yeah, I counted up after I stopped working for CNN last Christmas. I didn't renew my contract in 2024 because I had some other things I wanted to do. Um, but I started counting up the number of times I appeared on TV, and it was over 4,000 in a 10-year period of time. But they were all for like minute and a half to 3 minute burst. So on topics that, if I were to name some of the topics, you'd say, well, that's understandable. You're talking about Ukraine or Israel. But then some other ones like they called me up when, I don't know if you remember when the so-called Chinese balloon was flying across the country. I know nothing about balloons, so I had to start doing some research and talking to some people before I went on the air, and everything in between. So it was kind of crazy.
That's really interesting. I'm sure you had a lot of stories that you had to touch on because, I mean, the world is always evolving and there's always a threat somewhere. Um, Speaking on that, and just kind of your experience from, and how long was your career in the military again? Remind me.
8 years.
Okay, so that's a long time. Yeah.
It's half the time. You add to that the 4 years I spent at West Point, so it's total of 42 years. Yeah.
Yeah, so you've been able to see kind of not only the military, but just also technology as well. So this is kind of a two-part question. For your perspective, how has the nature of warfare evolved during your time? And then also, how do you see the field of national security evolving as well as new technologies are emerging like AI?
Well, the first thing I'd say is the people have evolved. When I first entered the Army, it was a draft Army. So people were still being told, hey, your numbers come up, so you have to join the Army. I mean, young people like you, they might interrupt college, or you might say, well, I want a college deferment. But then in 1980, no, it was later, earlier than that. I think it was 1978, a law was signed making us a professional army. So that was a requirement for people who wanted to join, joined. And there were a lot of benefits to joining. So you had a professional force that made a career, or at least a percentage of people made a career out of being in the army. So it was radically different in terms of how we trained, how we executed operations. The other thing I saw was coming into the force. I graduated from West Point in 1975. That was about the time that the Vietnam War was ending. So the Army was in very bad shape. All the services were in bad shape because they had executed a war that most Americans didn't agree with, and that uh, it was a draft force, so most of them didn't want to go to Vietnam. And now we were going to a force where we were focused on other areas like the defense of Europe, going back to a Cold War environment. And we didn't have the force to do that at the time. So there were some really smart and innovative leaders in the Army. Uh, People like you may know the name Colin Powell, or people like him, who said we've got to radically change what the Army does. So it went through a period of transformation from about 1978 until about 1986, where acquisition of new equipment, modernization of the force, changes in doctrine, changes in training and leader development, even the establishment of something we call a training center that's in California. There's a place in California called the National Training Center. There's another one in southern Louisiana called the Joint Readiness Training Center. Another one in Germany called the Joint Multinational Training Center, where units go for a certain period of time, and against an opposing force, they literally conduct mock battles where they learn how to be better. We're the only army in the world that does that, by the way. And I think that's what makes us so good, because we train under very tough circumstances and near combat-like conditions, so that we learn how to be better, so that our leaders know how to lead better with equipment that breaks down and does the kind of things that you would expect in a normal combat operation, but you have to deal with it. So that was a period of rapid transformation of this large 2 million person military. And then, right about the end, when we felt like we were starting to get it all together, Operation Desert Storm came about in 1990 and 91, where we were able to prove just how good we were, going up against the fourth largest army in the world with the Iraqis and beating them in a 4-day period, basically. So those are the kind of things that I learned. And then going forward into the 21st century, uh, what I saw on the battlefield was an increased use of intelligence, mastering intelligence, and even the forefathers of AI, uh, new dispositions of organizations, and a constant change, an increase in soldier skill and requirements, and then thrown into what's called a counterinsurgency environment in both Iraq and Afghanistan, which tested the army significantly and showed some additional flaws in a large and long time warfare. Uh, but during that period of time, you saw an increased professionalism on the part of the leaders and the soldiers, but you also saw a rapid increase of new equipment, new technologies that changed the face of warfare. And now we're seeing that obviously in Ukraine with the emergence of drone warfare and rapid tethered first-person optics in terms of being able to conduct reconnaissance. So that's a long explanation of a 40-year career of seeing a whole lot of differences in how we did things in the military.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I had no idea that we did those mock battles and practiced like that. That's really interesting to hear about. I really had no idea that even happened.
The training center in California, which was a place that I worked as what they call the commander of the operations group, which was conducting the training for units coming in. It is twice the size of the state of Rhode Island. And when units come in to train, they're told, here's the battlefield condition. The enemy was another U.S. unit that lives out there all the time. They have all the tricks of the trade. So you're facing a superior force when you go out to train in order to show your mistakes that you're going to make on the battlefield. And it's completely modernized in terms of simulations. Every person is wearing a device that shows exactly where they are at any given time. The equipment has those same devices on it, so you can track in real time where different things are. You have literally the sport of laser tag originated at this place because you literally have long range lasers instead of saying, like we used to do when I was new to the Army, when you're making these mock battles, you go over the radio, hey, I shot you. No, I shot you first. Well, this one, there's no doubt about who shot first and what they killed because it would set off kind of a laser tag device. But you also have what they call observer controllers that worked for me when I commanded out there that was watching everything the unit did in real time and radioing back the kind of actions they were taking. It's a fascinating place. And then every 24 to 48 hours, everything would stop and we'd have what's called an after action review, where we would pull all the leaders into one location and talk to them about what they did right, what they did wrong, how to fix it before the next battle so they don't get whacked again, and how they got to better train their soldiers. So it really is kind of a unique environment for improving organizations.
Wow. Um, you learn new things every day. Um,
Yeah.
so kind of going off of that with you said the emerging technologies, the military is really quick to adapt to that. Are they from your perspective, with artificial intelligence in particular, do you see it being more of a negative towards military forces, or do you think they're going to have some positives? I mean, obviously, with everything, there's negatives and positives, but do you see one or the other outweighing?
Yeah, it's interesting because what I'll share with you is I first heard the term artificial intelligence in 2008. And it was during a time when our special operations forces were experimenting with it primarily because they were overwhelmed with information. And they had to find the way to parse that into packages that gave them the best information to conduct operations against an enemy in a combat situation. Um, it's been fascinating for me. In fact, I'll reach over here for just a minute. I just got this book on the advice of, somebody that teaches at the school where I teach. And as I'm reading through it, the subtitle is Harnessing AI to Make Faster, Smarter Decisions. That's what everybody wants to do. The problem is what I see in the classroom and what I saw at times in the military is there's just like any new technologies, there's sometimes an over-reliance on it being right and you have to incorporate your own common sense, which requires a smarter person to understand what's right and what's wrong, what's real, what's Memorex, as the old commercial used to say.
Yeah, I had a professor, I just graduated from Virginia Tech, and he would always be like, it's a tool. It's kind of like a phone. It's a tool or anything else that you have when you're growing up. It's often a tool. It's not the actual source of the information. And I've run into it with my own studies myself of looking up a question and it gives me an answer. And I'm like, that's not right. Or I'd be like, oh, okay, that's new. And then you go and you do an actual Google search, or at least you hope someone does. and it ends up not being anything that actually exists.
Yeah, I'll share a story with you. I had a class, I teach leadership, and I had a class of MBA students, and one of the assignments is to break down in groups, and each group does a different leadership theory. So transactional, transformational, servant leadership, laissez-faire. And the requirement is to give the group gives a presentation. So the second group came up and they were given a presentation on one of the theories. And I'm looking, first of all, it hit me. I was listening to them and then I was looking at their slides that they were presenting. And the slides looked an awful lot like something that Gamma would produce. So, I was listening to how they were talking about the theory, where it came from. And it was pretty evident that they didn't have an in-depth knowledge of the theory. So what I started doing, being the mean professor that I am, I started asking probing questions. And when they got off the topic that was on the slide that they had created through the use of AI and Gamma, or Chat GPT and Gamma, they were lost as last year's Easter egg. So it was a lesson for them that you can't necessarily depend on AI if you don't know the subject matter.
I had a professor, unfortunately, I knew someone, uh, and they had, used it for a project, and he was like, "All right, we're gonna open up and one folder in my drive, and every class after was, you have to do this, you have to put it in the folder so I could see your editing history." And I mean, it's sad that we have to do it, but I thought it was a very efficient way as a
Well,
professor.
yeah, I'll tell you another story about AI because we have as part of our course syllabus when they can and when they can't use it and how to cite it and all that other kind of stuff that students need. But I had another MBA student in my class who, as we were talking about leadership, she was talking about how her manager was a very toxic leader. And every time she went into his office to address an issue, he would call her in and she'd first say, what, yeah, he'd send her an email saying, yeah, I want you to come in and talk about this. Here's some of the problems we have. So she would always go in and there would be a very toxic and condescending conversation. So she started taking his emails and putting them into Chat GPT and saying, okay, here's the email I got. I know I'm going to go in and talk to him about this subject. What should I expect based on his leadership style? And how should I prepare myself to answer the question? That's a great use of AI.
Yeah.
It really prepares you for any eventuality you might face.
Yeah, it's as a student and then as someone who's helping a current professor, it's interesting to see both sides of the story. Um, and even with my own friends currently, we've had, accusations of using AI or just a judgment of character without having papers presented before. And it's just really interesting to see how, like you said, AI, you heard it for the first time in 2008. And I went to a class lecture on it. It's not a new thing. A lot of people think it is new, and no, it's been around for quite a while. So, but that's a smart way to use it with, a boss like that. So kind of pivoting away from that a little bit, with threat landscape. That's a big thing going on around, specifically with cyber attacks, which kind of ties into AI a little bit, and misinformation. Just how do you feel related to those two with cyber attacks and misinformation? Do you think those are going to be our biggest threats, technologically, or do you see something else being a larger threat moving forward?
Yeah, if you just put it in the technological space, if you say
Mhm.
that kind of threat is our biggest, I actually think that it's hard for me to put this in the right approach because it's going to sound awful no matter what I say. But from a cyber perspective, cyber attacks are almost the same in the same category as a nuclear attack. And what I mean by that is, all during the Cold War and after World War II, everyone was concerned about the atom bomb and the hydrogen bomb and all that because there was, once it starts, it's very difficult to stop. The so-called mutual assured destruction. We, as a nation, the larger nations, have not seen a major cyber attack in conjunction with with a conventional attack because it would be so incredibly disruptive in terms of life and property and processes and systems that would almost be as bad in terms of disruption of humankind as a major nuclear war would be. I did see, and I'll share a little experience with you. I did see one nation attack another nation in a large scale cyber attack, and that was Russia against Estonia. And I don't know if you've ever read about the Estonian attacks of 2007, but in that year, the Russian government, well, Russian hackers and cyber attackers basically shut down the country of Estonia because I'll tell you the long story. They had a statue of a soldier, a Soviet soldier in a cemetery in Estonia that they wanted to move out of the town square into a cemetery. It was a tribute to the Soviets that had played there in World War II. Well, the Soviet or the Russian government was really pissed about that, and they warned them not to do it. And as a result of them doing it, they started hitting them with increasingly lethal cyber attacks. So they first shut down all the government DOS services, then they shut down a lot of private sector elements, shut down the hospitals, got to the point that they were even shutting down traffic lights. And this cyber attack on the country of Estonia lasted for, I think it was 27 days. Uh,
Wow.
it completely shut down the nation. Now, as a result of that, by the way, Estonia has learned how to counter those things, and they are now considered NATO's cyber center of excellence. So they actually have a building in the middle of Tallinn, which is where the cyber center of excellence is. And they vote by computers now. They have all their servers in Luxembourg outside of the country. So they have now hardened their facilities based on the lessons they learned in 2007. It's a fascinating case study for you to take a look at. But I don't think that's our biggest threat right now. I think our biggest threat is the second one you mentioned, the categories of misinformation, disinformation, and I'll add a third one of malinformation. People don't talk about the malinformation all that much, but that's the deliberate attack on the trust in institutions. Some are just lies, some are misdirections, the mis and disinformation, but the malinformation is purposely used to destroy a nation or a body of people's faith in their institutions. And I think we're seeing the early stages of that. And I believe personally, that's one of our top four threats to our country because most of it's coming from within. And that's very dangerous.
Yeah, talking on both sides as a student regarding misinformation and disinformation, that's usually all we're told about is those two topics. I didn't even know that third category even existed. And then branching off onto the cyber realm of things, I don't know if you've read the book. It's called Lights Out. And it kind of talks about how, what would happen if we were attacked on a cyber grid. And it talks about, I didn't realize until I read the book that we're all pretty much on the same type of system. And so we all kind of already know each other's systems. It's just a matter of who's going to act first, which hopefully doesn't take place. Or if it does, not anytime soon. Um, but yeah, that's just really interesting. I'd like to hear more on the third category, if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, first let me talk about the cyber because when I retired and started working for a healthcare organization, from my time in the military, knowing how we protect our systems, our cyber systems, I went to the chief information officer of the hospital and I said, "How are you prepared for a cyber attack?" And this was in 2013. And he looked at me like I had three heads. And he said, "Well, our computers are hardened and we have encrypted devices." And I said, "Yeah, yeah, but what happens if someone tries to shut you down? Have you ever rehearsed that or practiced how you would deal with that?" And he says, "Well, the lights will turn on." And his was at the time, a very simplistic approach. He didn't realize that it would affect machines in the patient's rooms or in the operating rooms. how it would affect their billing processes, and how it would screw things up, how it would affect their electronic medical records. So it was a very simplistic approach to something that could completely wipe out healthcare in a short period of time, where people, again, going back to the malinformation, would lose faith in being taken care of at their local emergency room. So that's the criticality of cyber linked to malinformation. Um, in terms of going to the malinformation, there are, I got to be careful how I say this, there are nations in the world that are purposely uh, generating AI sources that are directed toward the dissolution of trust in various institutions that a nation state has. So when you look at it that way, it's almost a form of well, it's not almost, it is a form of warfare. It is like attacking a government or attacking the private sector industries in a country, and making them distrust anything from, I don't know, will a weapon system work in a military environment, all the way to, like I said, with the hospitals, will an emergency room continue to perform if all the lights go out? So those are the kind of things that not only might happen, but when people are preparing you by talking about it and issuing false narratives, it could cause dangers that would destroy an organization.
Right, because if you even look back, I think it was maybe about a month ago, where the Canvas systems and Amazon Web Services, all of that happened, and we saw how chaotic even that was, just simple institutional level, or even, oh no, my Amazon package might not make it on time.
Right.
Um, but most people don't think our traffic systems, our purchasing things at the grocery store, how to get gas, everything relies on our cyber grid. And I at least hope that there are measures being taken to prepare for these, even though I think it's a little more difficult. Um, as an outsider, civilian type of perspective, I think it might be a little harder to prepare in that way.
Yeah, well, I'm currently reading a book called The Crash of 1929 by Andrew Ross Sorkin, and he's talking about primarily the damages that can be done in the financial institutions of our country. But what you just said really connects to that, because as he's saying, well, these same kind of things that happened during the crash of 29 could happen today, and we're leading toward that. That's the thesis of the book. What I was looking at is exactly what you just said, is what happens when suddenly the electronics messaging system in our banking industry is suddenly shut down. And then ATMs don't work. And then, you can't get in a bank to get your money. You can't pay your bills. You can't pay your rent, those kind of things. It's a cascading effect that is almost beyond our imagination of how we would counter that by just going after the banks, for example.
I mean, there's so many sectors that rely on one grid, and it's one attack that completely eliminates everything. And it's actually terrifying to think of. Like you said, it's one mistake or or I can't remember what it was a couple years ago. It was one section of code that completely just made everything go um haywire. There was nothing that we could do for it until we figured it out. But yeah,
Well,
that's really,
let me relate that to the military for you, if I can, because we spend a lot of money on Department of Defense. And people are saying, why are we spending that much money? Well, the reason is because we as a country want a military that can defend us against any aggressors, foreign and domestic. But as these threat streams get wider, where it's not just conventional war needing tanks and airplanes and ships, but instead it requires a cyber force like what we're talking about, well, that drains from all the other things. So the question then becomes, what can you do? What threats do you have to prepare for? And what do you kind of put off to the side and say, well, that might happen, but it's less likely to happen. So
Mhm.
we're going to take a risk in that. And that's the kind of things that senior leaders in a government and the military face every day.
Right. Um, to kind of go off of that, to kind of end on a high of our conversation,
Yeah, let's make
um,
it happy a little bit. Yeah.
let's have some happy conversation, following that. Um, just kind of what are your hopes for the future? What advice do you have for young individuals like myself who are trying to get into this field, whether militarily or on the civilian side of things?
Well, I'm now going to say some radical things, okay? After dealing with the class of 25 at West Point for 4 years, I am more enthused than ever about your generation. There are a lot of people who are slamming the Z's and the things they do. But I learned a long time ago in the military when I was dealing with a bunch of soldiers from multiple generations in any kind of organization that, they may have quirks and they may have, different ways of approaching things or different interests. But from my perspective as a leader, I've got to understand those and deal with all of them. There aren't that many boomers, folks from my generation, who are going to say something like that. They just want to kind of push aside the younger generation and say, well, they're just lazy or they don't want to do things or So that's number one. I have more faith in your generation than I had even in mine. The second thing, and I'm not sucking up to you just because you're a woman, but what I will say is I really, and I've said this to my wife and our two sons on multiple occasions, I think women are going to save us. We've allowed men to screw things up for so long, and what I see, first of all, I have physical evidence of it in both the classroom and in healthcare and in the military. Uh, some of the best leaders I found in each one of those organizations were women. And I think it's because of certain personality characteristics. I worked with an organization, or I still work with an organization part-time called Women in Medicine. And last year at one of their conferences, a couple of the female physicians gave a presentation on surgical outcomes comparing men and women. And the women were far outperforming the men in terms of surgery performance by multiple research studies. So I think, and they attributed it to several things, which I won't go into now because they are very controversial. But one of those was the nurturing nature of women versus the ego-driven nature of men. So that's number two. Number three is what we talked about a minute ago, and that's technology. It can be our friend or it can be our greatest enemy. We have seen the power of computing, the power of electronic networking, but we've also seen the detrimental effects of both of those things. I think the same is going to be true in cyber and in AI, artificial intelligence. So I'm putting it on you, it's up to your generation, the smart ones, to figure that out and to make sure we go down a right pathway in terms of getting it done. And one of the ways that I'll propose that your generation do that is to get more involved in selfless politics and selfless actions and a return to values and ethics and character development as opposed to just new education on emerging topics. I mean, what I'd say, my advice is you got to mix the old with the new a little bit.
Great. Well, we really appreciate you taking the time to meet with me today, and the in-networker is grateful that you were willing to do this interview with us. And we had a really insightful conversation, so we just want to say thank you.
Well, thank you, Haley. Thank you, and my best to everybody at Virginia Tech. It's one of my favorite schools.
Thank you. Go
Okay.
Hokies.
Yeah, go Hokies. All right.
Yeah,
Thank you. Appreciate
yeah,
it.
of course.